The wind had teeth, and it was chewing on the bones of the world. Leanne felt it in her own marrow, a cold so deep it felt like a final judgment. Each step was a battle against the accumulating snow, which clung to the hem of her worn wool coat and tried to steal the heat from her legs. The small wooden wagon, her only inheritance from a life that had promised more, was a cruel anchor. One of its wheels, warped from a long journey and the biting frost, wobbled with a sickening rhythm, threatening to splinter with every yard she gained. It groaned a complaint that was lost in the shriek of the blizzard sweeping through the Montana Territory pines. She leaned into the pulling ropes, the coarse fiber digging into her gloved hands, her breath pluming and freezing in an instant. She was alone, a tiny, determined figure in a vast, indifferent expanse of white. Her husband, Wei, had told her of the beauty of these mountains. He had not spoken of their fury. He had died helping to lay the iron tracks that cut through them, his last letter speaking of a small piece of land he'd secured, a place for them to build a life. Now, that piece of paper, tucked inside a silk pouch beneath her layers of clothing, was all she had of him, and the land it promised was a phantom on the other side of this storm. The sound reached her first, a low rumble that was not the wind. It was the rhythmic crunch of heavy hooves and the groan of a much larger, sturdier wagon. She straightened, her heart a cold knot in her chest. Travelers in a storm this bad were either desperate or dangerous. She pulled her wagon further to the side of the barely visible track, lowering her head, hoping to be nothing more than a snow-dusted log, a trick of the eye. But the sound grew louder, resolving into the shape of two powerful draft horses and a freight wagon covered by a thick canvas top. A man sat at the reins, a heavy buffalo coat making his shoulders seem as wide as the wagon itself. He pulled the horses to a halt beside her, the animals steaming in the frigid air. Leanne kept her eyes down, staring at the treacherous wheel of her cart. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and assessing. Silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the jingle of harness. She braced herself for the word she expected, the cruel dismissal she had heard in every town since leaving the coast. Instead, a voice, rough as granite, cut through the gale. "Get in my wagon." It was not a question. It was a command, low and guttural. She looked up then, unable to stop herself. The man's face was half hidden by a thick, frost-tipped beard and the shadow of a low-brimmed hat, but his eyes were clear and sharp. They took in her slight frame, the failing cart, and the exhaustion she knew was etched on her face. Fear warred with a desperate, crushing weariness. To accept a stranger's help was a risk no woman traveling alone should take. But to refuse was to lie down and let the snow become her shroud. The forest was already growing dark, the blizzard intensifying with the fading light. He had not moved, had not repeated himself. He simply waited, his patience a more potent force than any argument. With a slow, deliberate nod, she released the ropes of her own wagon. The small cart settled into the snowdrift like a surrendered thing. The rancher, who had not yet offered his name, climbed down from his seat with a stiff grace. He moved with the deliberation of a man who conserves his energy for when it matters. Without a word, he lifted her small, rickety wagon as if it were a child's toy and lashed it to the back of his own massive freight wagon. He did not ask what was in it, he did not seem to care. He simply secured it with thick leather straps, his movements economical and sure even in the driving snow. Leanne watched, a silent observer to her own rescue, her hands tucked into her sleeves to stop their trembling. When he was done, he gestured to the passenger seat beside him. "Get up," he said, the words clipped. Storms not waiting, she used the iron step, her legs clumsy with cold, and settled onto the wooden bench. The man climbed back up, the wagon groaning under his weight, and took the reins. With a low call to his horses, the wagon lurched forward, leaving the small patch of trampled snow where she had made her stand. The world inside the partial shelter of the driver's seat was only marginally better than the open storm. The wind still whipped around the edges of the canvas, but the relentless sting of the snow was gone. She sat rigid, as far from him as the bench would allow, her gaze fixed on the broad, snow-dusted backs of the horses. He did not speak for what felt like miles. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the muffled thud of hooves, and the unending howl of the wind. She risked a glance at him. His focus was entirely on the path ahead, his eyes narrowed as he navigated the nearly invisible track. He was older than she first thought, the lines around his eyes carved deep by sun and hardship. There was no softness in his face, only a kind of stark endurance. She wondered what sort of man would stop for a stranger, a Chinese woman at that, in the middle of a blizzard. Was it pity? Or something worse? She had learned long ago that kindness from men like him often came with a price she was unwilling to pay. Therefore, she remained silent, a statue of wariness, ready to fight or flee if she had to. The silence itself became a character in their journey, a heavy blanket of unspoken questions and assumptions. He smelled of pine smoke, wet wool, and cold leather. It was a clean, earthy scent, not the stale odor of whiskey and cheap cigars she had come to associate with danger. The small details were confusing, contradictory. He had the look of a hard man, yet he had stopped. He was gruff and commanding, yet he had handled her meager belongings with care. She did not know what to make of him, and the not knowing was its own form of tension. The landscape, a churning chaos of white, offered no distraction. They were a small, self-contained world, moving slowly through an apocalypse of snow. The horses suddenly tossed their heads, their ears twitching. The rancher pulled back on the reins, his body tensing. "Whoa now, easy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble meant to soothe the animals. Ahead, a shape had emerged from the swirling snow, a dark slash against the white. It was a massive pine, its roots torn from the frozen earth, lying directly across the track. The path was completely blocked. The man let out a low curse, the sound swallowed by the wind. "Well," he said, more to himself than to her, "that's that." He set the brake, the iron lever groaning in protest. He looked at the tree, then at the steep, timber-choked inclines on either side of the track. There was no going around it. For the first time since she'd climbed into his wagon, he turned and looked directly at her. "Stay put," he ordered. "I'll see if I can move it." He swung himself down and disappeared toward the massive trunk, taking a length of heavy chain from a hook on the side of the wagon. Leanne watched him go, the knot of anxiety in her stomach tightening. The tree was enormous. One man, no matter how strong, was not going to move it. She saw him wrap the chain around the trunk, trying to find a purchase point. He pulled, his boots slipping in the snow, his breath coming in ragged plumes. The tree did not budge. He tried again, repositioning the chain, his shoulders straining against the impossible weight. It was useless. He stood back, hands on his hips, staring at the obstacle, a silhouette of frustration against the storm. He was going to give up. He would unhitch the horses, leave the wagon, and save himself. That was the logical thing to do. She and her cart would be abandoned with his. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold through her, one that had nothing to do with the temperature. But he did not move toward the horses. He just stood there, staring at the tree as if he could dismantle it with the force of his will alone. Leanne found herself moving before she had made a conscious decision to do so. She climbed down from the wagon, her boots sinking deep into the snow. The wind hit her with renewed force, but she ignored it. She walked toward him, her eyes scanning the fallen tree and the surrounding woods. Wei had been an engineer, a man who understood leverage and forces. He had loved to explain these things to her, drawing diagrams in the dirt with a stick. The right tool and the right angle, he used to say, can move the world. Her eyes landed on a smaller, fallen log nearby, thick as a man's thigh and about 8 feet long. It was solid hardwood. She pointed. "There," she said, her voice thin in the wind. The rancher turned, surprised to see her beside him. He followed her gesture. "What about it?" he growled, his patience clearly worn thin. "A lever," she said simply. "We need a fulcrum." A rock. She began searching the base of the tree, kicking away snow until she found a large, flat-topped stone half buried in the frozen ground. It was perfectly positioned. The rancher stared at her, then at the log, then at the rock. A flicker of something, not quite respect but perhaps surprise, crossed his face. He said nothing, but he walked over to the log she had indicated. He tested its weight, then dragged it into position, lodging one end under the main trunk of the massive pine and resting the middle of the pole on the stone she had found. It was a crude but perfectly executed lever. Together, he grunted, positioning himself at the far end. On 3 she took her place beside him, her small frame looking absurd next to his bulk. But when he counted, she put every ounce of her remaining strength into pushing down. The log groaned. The great tree shifted, scraping against the frozen earth. It moved only an inch, but it moved. Again, he commanded. They heaved again, and then again, coordinating their efforts in a silent rhythm. Sweat beaded on his brow, and her own muscles screamed in protest. Slowly, painstakingly, they leveraged the tree sideways, inch by grueling inch, until they had cleared a space just wide enough for the wagon to pass. He stood, breathing heavily, and looked not at the cleared path, but at her. "You've done that before," he stated. It wasn't a question. "My husband taught me," she replied quietly. He understood how things work for the first time. A hint of something other than grim necessity entered his expression. He gave a short, sharp nod and walked back to the wagon. The rest of the journey passed in a different kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but of shared effort. The tension had not vanished, but its character had changed. When they finally broke free of the trees, the wind was just as fierce, but the landscape opened into rolling hills. In the distance, a single point of yellow light glowed feebly through the snow. A house! As they drew closer, the light resolved into a lantern hanging by the door of a solid-looking log home, with a large barn and several corrals nearby. It was a lonely outpost, a fortress against the wilderness. He guided the horses toward the barn, the animals moving with renewed energy, sensing shelter. "This is it," he said. "My place." He brought the wagon to a stop inside the cavernous barn, the sudden stillness and quiet as shock after the roar of the storm. The air smelled of hay, animals, and dry wood. He climbed down and began unhitching the horses, his movements practiced and efficient. "You can stay in the tack room," he said, his back to her. "There's a cot." It's warmer than the house. The offer was pragmatic, not personal. It kept her out of his home while still providing shelter. It was the offer of a man used to being alone, a man who did not invite complications into his life. Leanne simply nodded, though he could not see her. She was too tired to argue, too grateful for the warmth to care about the location. As he led the horses to their stalls, the barn door creaked open, spilling a rectangle of swirling snow into the relative calm. A man stood silhouetted against the storm. He was tall and slender, dressed in a fine city coat that looked out of place against the raw frontier. "Blackwood," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, but with an undercurrent of steel. "I was beginning to wonder if the storm had claimed you." The rancher, Silas Blackwood, turned slowly. His face, which had shown a flicker of unguarded respect at the fallen tree, was now a mask of cold granite. "Thorn," he said, his voice flat. "What do you want?" The man, Thorn, stepped further into the barn, stamping the snow from his immaculate boots. His eye swept the space, landing on Leanne where she still sat on the wagon bench. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Just checking on my investments, Silas. Making sure the valley's assets are secure." His gaze lingered on Leanne, dismissive and sharp at the same time. "Looks like you've picked up some stray freight." Silas moved to stand between Thorn and the wagon, a subtle but unmistakable blocking motion. "She's a traveler, caught in the storm." "That's all." Thorn chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Travelers can bring trouble. Unwanted attention. We have a quiet valley here. I like to keep it that way." He took a step closer, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Especially with the new survey lines being drawn. A man wants to be sure his claims are clear, with no complications." The words were aimed at Silas, but his eyes were on Leanne. It was a clear, unspoken threat. She was the complication. Her presence here was a problem for this man. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping in from the open door. This was not a social call. This was a warning. Jedediah Thorne was a man who owned more than land. He owned the quiet, and he would not tolerate anything that disturbed it. Silas's jaw tightened. "My property, my business," he said, his voice dangerously low. "The road is that way." Thorne held up his hands in mock surrender. Of course, of course." Just a neighborly visit." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You have a good night, Blackwood. And do be careful with your guests. Some things are more fragile than they appear." With that, he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving a profound and menacing silence in his wake. After Thorne left, Silas finished tending to his horses without another word. The air in the barn was thick with what had not been said. He finally turned to Leanne, his expression grim. "The tack room is through there," he gestured with his chin. "I'll bring you something to eat." He did not explain who Thorne was, or what he had meant by his veiled threats. He simply retreated back into his gruff, solitary shell. Leanne found the room. It was small and smelled of leather and saddle soap. A narrow cot with a pile of clean wool blankets sat against one wall, and a small, pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, a bucket of coal beside it. It was more than she could have hoped for. She built a small fire in the stove, her hands clumsy but determined. As the small space began to warm, she finally allowed the exhaustion of the day to wash over her. She sat on the edge of the cot, every muscle aching, and wondered what kind of trouble she had brought to this silent man's door. A short while later, Silas appeared with a wooden tray. On it was a bowl of thick beef stew, a chunk of dark bread, and a mug of steaming coffee. He set it on a small crate near the stove without meeting her eyes. "Eat," he said, and turned to leave. "Wait," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He paused in the doorway. "Thank you." "Fuck everything." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Storm should break by morning. You can be on your way then." He started to close the door. "Your neighbor," she said, pressing the issue. "Mr. Thorne. He does not seem to like travelers." Silas stopped again. He looked back at her, his face shadowed in the dim lantern light. "Thorne doesn't like anything he can't own or control. Best you're gone from this valley come sunrise." The warning was stark, and it confirmed the fear that had taken root in her heart. This place was not safe. She ate the stew, the warmth spreading through her, chasing away some of the deep chill. When she was done, she reached for the one possession that mattered most. From her small wagon, she retrieved a modest, carved wooden box. She brought it back to the warmth of the tack room and sat with it on her lap. Inside, wrapped in silk, were her husband's last things, a few letters, his railroad service papers, and a folded, official-looking document. The deed. She unfolded it carefully. It was a homestead claim for 40 acres, filed provisionally and awaiting a final signature at the Territorial Land Office in the town of Redemption, a day's ride north. The description of the plot was precise, marked by a stream and a distinctive granite outcropping. This piece of paper was the reason for her entire journey. It was Way's legacy, her only hope for a future. The door opened again. It was Silas, come to collect the tray. He stopped when he saw the document spread across her lap. His eyes, accustomed to reading the land, scanned the legal description. He did not ask permission but reached for the paper. Leanne flinched but let him take it. He held it closer to the lantern light, his brow furrowed in concentration. He read it once, then twice. A strange expression crossed his face. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice rough with something she couldn't identify. "It was my husband's," she said. "He worked for the railroad. This was part of his pay. He died before we could build." Silas looked from the paper to her, and for the first time, he seemed to see her not as a burden or a complication, but as a person with a history. "This land," he said slowly, Section 17, north of the ridge. "I know this land." He traced the boundaries on the map with a calloused finger. "Most folks think it's worthless. Alkali soil, mostly rock. Can't grow much of anything there." He paused, his gaze distant. "But they're wrong." He looked at her, his eyes sharp and serious. "It has the only year-round spring on the north end of this valley. In a dry summer, that spring is worth more than a gold mine. Suddenly, Jedediah Thorne's visit made a terrifying kind of sense. The new survey lines he'd mentioned, his talk of clear claims, he wanted that water. He knows, Leanne whispered, the realization dawning on her. Thorne. That is why he wants me gone. Silas nodded grimly. He's been buying up claims all over the valley, trying to corner the water rights. He must have found out about this one. Figured your husband was dead and the claim was abandoned. He was just waiting for it to expire so he could file on it himself. You're showing up, you're not a complication, you're a threat to his entire plan. He handed the deed back to her, his movements gentle. He then sat on the edge of the crate, the weariness of the world seeming to settle on his broad shoulders. I had a place once, he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual gruffness. Down south of here. Good land. My wife, Sarah, she loved it. We built it up from nothing. He stared at the glowing stove, but he was seeing something else entirely. A man like Thorne came along. Used the law like a club. Found a loophole in my filing, a mistake by a clerk. Bribed a judge. Took the whole place right out from under me. Sarah, she got sick that winter. A fever. Without the ranch, without the money. I couldn't get her the help she needed. He fell silent. The story hung in the small, warm room, a ghost of a loss so profound it was still palpable. He looked at Leanne, and the shared experience of being on the outside, of having something precious threatened by a powerful, greedy man, created a bridge between them. He will not take this from you, Silas said, and it was not a promise, but a statement of fact. Tomorrow, we don't run. Tomorrow, we ride to redemption. The decision hung in the air, solid and irrevocable. But Thorne was not a man who waited for his plans to be undone. A sudden, frantic whinny from the barn shattered the quiet. One of the horses screamed, a sound of pure terror. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of grim fury. Stay here, he commanded, grabbing a heavy rifle that leaned in the corner. Bar the door. He was gone before she could reply. Leanne rushed to the door and slid the heavy wooden bar into place. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Through a small, grimy window, she saw it. A flickering orange light was growing against the far wall of the barn, casting dancing, monstrous shadows. Fire! Thorne's men. They hadn't waited for morning. They were trying to burn him out, to destroy everything he had, and her with it. The smell of smoke began to seep under the door. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. But then she thought of the deed in her hand, of Silas's story, of the quiet determination in his eyes. She would not be a fragile thing that broke. A shot rang out, loud and clear even over the roar of the growing fire. Then another. She could hear shouting outside, men's voices raised in anger and panic. Silas was fighting back. But he was one man. She looked around the tack room, her eyes darting, searching. Her gaze fell on the water buckets kept for the horses. They were full. It wasn't much, but it was something. Unbarring the door, she hefted one of the heavy buckets and ran out into the main part of the barn. The smoke was thick and acrid, burning her throat and eyes. The flames were climbing the dry timber wall, greedily consuming the hay stored nearby. She threw the water at the base of the fire. It hissed and steamed, momentarily beaten back. She ran for another bucket, her lungs screaming for air. She could see Silas now, using the corner of a stall for cover, his rifle firing methodically at two figures retreating into the swirling snow. They returned fire, the shots splintering the wood around him. He was driving them off, but the fire was his more immediate enemy. He saw her then, a small figure wrestling with another bucket of water. He shouted something she couldn't hear over the crackle of the flames. She ignored him, throwing the second bucket, then a third. He saw her resolve and changed tactics. Leaving his cover, he ran to the main water pump in the center of the barn, working the handle with powerful, frantic strokes, refilling the buckets as fast as she could empty them. Together, in the smoke and chaos, they fought the fire, a desperate, silent team. Finally, with the attackers gone and their clothes soaked and smelling of smoke, they brought the blaze under control. The fire was out, leaving a gaping, charred hole in the side of the barn and a thick, choking pall in the air. They stood in the smoldering darkness, breathing hard, the danger past but the consequences just beginning. Silas had made an enemy of the most powerful man in the valley. He had chosen to stand with her, and now Thorn would stop at nothing to destroy them both. 3 months later, the snow was gone, replaced by the vibrant green of a Montana spring. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new pine growth. On a small plot of land north of the ridge, a sturdy one-room cabin stood, the raw, light-colored wood of its walls still fragrant with the scent of fresh-cut timber. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney. Leanne stood in the doorway, her hands braced on the frame, and looked out at her land. Her land! The word still felt new, miraculous. The journey to redemption had been tense, with both she and Silas watching the trail behind them, but Thorn had not shown himself. At the land office, the clerk had been dismissive of her at first, until Silas Blackwood stepped up behind her, his sheer physical presence and quiet, unyielding gaze making the man suddenly much more helpful. The deed was stamped, signed, and registered. The 40 acres with the priceless spring were officially hers. The news of the attempted arson, coupled with a formal complaint filed by Silas with the territorial marshal who passed through a week later, had shattered Jedediah Thorn's veneer of respectability. Whispers turned to accusations, and other ranchers, long intimidated by Thorn, began to speak of his strong-arm tactics. His power, built on fear, began to crumble when it was met with open resistance. He was now a man under investigation, his ambitions checked, his reputation in tatters. Leanne's small victory had become a catalyst for a larger change in the valley. She had not done it alone. Silas had been there every step of the way. He had helped her clear the land for the cabin, showing her how to notch the logs, his quiet competence a steadying presence. They had worked together, falling into the same easy rhythm they'd found when moving the fallen tree. A partnership had been forged in the heart of that blizzard, solidified by the smoke and flames in the barn. Silas rode up now, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. He swung down from his saddle, his movements as economical as ever, but the harsh lines around his eye seemed softer than they had 3 months ago. "Brought you the window sashes from town," he said, nodding toward the mule. "And some seeds. It's time to get a garden in." He began to unload the supplies, placing a crate of vegetable seedlings on the ground. Leanne came down the steps and knelt beside the crate, running her fingers over the tender green shoots. Tomatoes, squash, beans. A future. A life-taking root in this soil that Way had dreamed of but never seen. "I have coffee on the stove," she said. It was an invitation she would never have dared to make that first night, and one he would never have accepted. Now, it was a simple, comfortable fact of their new reality. He nodded. "I'll get these unloaded first." He worked, and she watched him, this gruff, solitary man who had stopped on a frozen road for a stranger. He had seen a woman struggling, but he had found a partner. She had seen a threat, but she had found an ally. In this quiet valley, 2 lonely people, pushed to the margins by loss and prejudice, had found common ground. They had not sought it, but hardship had revealed it to them. Her small wagon, the one with the wobbling wheel, was parked beside her cabin. She had repaired the wheel, sanding the wood smooth and reinforcing it with a band of iron Silas had forged for her. It was a reminder of where she had come from and how far she had traveled. Silas finished his work and walked up to the cabin. He paused at the door, looking out at the land, at the spring that bubbled up from the rocks nearby, clear and cold. "It's a good spot," he said, his voice low. Way had a good eye. It was the first time he had said her husband's name. The simple acknowledgement was a gift, a closing of a circle. She smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Yes," she said. He did. They stood there for a moment, not as a rancher and a stray, but as neighbors. As friends. In the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the West, they had each discovered that the strongest shelter you could build was not made of logs and stone, but of the simple, unexpected kindness of another human being. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, Thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.